At the family reunion, my uncle said, "Isn't it time we controlled our women properly?" The potato salad fell from my hands and splattered across Aunt Catherine's white carpet, while everyone stared at Uncle Frank like he'd grown a second head. "I'm serious," he continued, setting down his beer and looking around the living room at the 23 family members gathered for Grandma's 85th birthday. "Look at the divorce rates. Look at society falling apart. It's because we stopped keeping women in their proper place." My cousin Lisa's mouth dropped open, and her new boyfriend shifted uncomfortably on the couch, while my mother gripped her wine glass so tight I thought it might shatter. "Frank, what the hell are you talking about?" My dad stood up from his recliner, his face already turning red the way it did when someone cut him off in traffic. But Uncle Frank wasn't backing down. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling through something, his face lit by the blue glow. "I've been reading about this online. There's a whole movement of men who understand what went wrong. Women got too much freedom, and now look where we are." He turned the phone toward us, showing some website with bold red text about reclaiming masculine authority and natural hierarchy. My 16-year-old daughter Megan was sitting next to me on the love seat, and I felt her whole body tense up. She'd been excited about this reunion, her first time seeing the extended family since before COVID, and now Uncle Frank was ruining everything with whatever rabbit hole he'd fallen down on the internet. "Uncle Frank?" I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Maybe this isn't the time or place for this conversation." But he turned those intense gray eyes on me, the same eyes that used to scare me as a kid when he'd babysit. "This is exactly the time, Jennifer. You're divorced, aren't you? And why? Because society told you that you didn't need to submit to your husband's authority." The room went silent except for the sound of Grandma's oxygen tank humming in the corner. She was watching everything unfold with those sharp blue eyes that missed nothing despite her age. My ex-husband Nathan had cheated on me with his secretary for 2 years, but apparently Uncle Frank had his own interpretation of events. "Now wait just a minute," Aunt Catherine started, but Frank held up his hand to silence her. The gesture was so dismissive, so casual, that it took everyone a second to process what had just happened. Catherine had been married to Frank for 37 years, had raised 4 kids with him, had her own successful real estate business, and he'd just dismissed her like a child interrupting adult conversation. "I'm talking, Catherine. You can speak when I'm finished." The transformation in Aunt Catherine's face was something I'll never forget. All the color drained out, then flooded back in a wave of fury that made her look 20 years younger. But before she could respond, Frank's oldest son, Michael, stood up. At 28, Michael was the golden child who'd followed in Frank's footsteps as an engineer, and everyone expected him to defend his mother. Instead, he nodded slowly. "Dad's got a point, actually. I've been reading the same stuff. Society has gotten too soft." Lisa threw her napkin on the coffee table and stood up so fast she knocked over her soda. "Are you both insane? This is 2024, not 1824. But Michael just smiled, that condescending smile I remembered from when we were kids, and he'd explain why girls couldn't play certain games. "That's exactly the problem, Lisa. We've let emotional thinking replace logic. Women are naturally more emotional, more nurturing. They're happiest when they have strong male leadership." "I have a PhD in biochemistry," Lisa shouted, her voice cracking with disbelief. "I run a research lab with 40 employees. Michael shrugged like this was irrelevant. "And are you happy? Are you married? Do you have kids?" The questions hung in the air like poison gas, and I watched Lisa's face crumble. She was 32, dedicated to her career, and these were clearly sore spots that Michael knew exactly how to press. Grandma's cough cut through the tension, rough and wet, the kind that had been getting worse despite the oxygen. Everyone turned to look at her, expecting her to need water or medicine, but instead, she was laughing. Actually laughing, though it sounded more like a wheeze. "Frank, you always were an idiot," she managed between coughs, "just like your father." The room went silent again because Grandpa had been dead for 15 years and was generally remembered as a saint. "Mother, you don't understand what's happening in society today," Frank started, but Grandma waved him off with one wrinkled hand. "I understand plenty. Your father tried the same nonsense in 1973. Had a whole group of his drinking buddies convinced they needed to reclaim their households. You know what happened?" She paused for another coughing fit, and Catherine brought her water. "I left him for 6 months. Took you kids to my sisters in Portland." This was news to everyone. The family story had always been that Grandma took a long vacation to help her sick sister, but now the truth was spilling out in this living room that suddenly felt too small for all of us. He learned real quick that he couldn't even operate the washing machine without me. Burned every meal. You kids were begging me to come back within 2 weeks. Frank's face was turning purple, but Grandma wasn't done. "When I came back, things were different. Equal. The way marriage should be." She looked directly at Catherine. "Don't you dare let him talk to you that way. Not in my presence. Not anywhere." Catherine straightened her spine and looked at Frank with something I'd never seen in her eyes before. It wasn't anger exactly. More like she was seeing him clearly for the first time in decades. But Frank wasn't ready to back down. He stood up, all 6'3" of him, towering over Grandma's wheelchair. Times were different then. Now we have science proving men and women are fundamentally different. Men are leaders. Women are supporters. It's biological. He pulled up another website on his phone, some pseudo-scientific article about brain differences and testosterone. My daughter Megan suddenly spoke up, her 16-year-old voice cutting through like a blade. "That's the same argument people use to justify slavery," she said quietly. Everyone turned to stare at her, and she lifted her chin, not backing down. "They said black people had different brains, were naturally suited to servitude. It was fake science then, and what you're reading is fake science now." I'd never been prouder of my daughter than in that moment, watching her stand up to a man 3 times her age and size. Michael laughed, but it was ugly, dismissive. "Leave it to a teenage girl to compare everything to slavery. This is about natural order, about what makes families strong." He gestured around the room. "Look at our family. Broken marriages, kids raised without fathers, women prioritizing careers over children. This is what feminism has brought us. My marriage ended because your uncle couldn't keep it in his pants, I snapped, surprising myself with the venom in my voice. Not because of feminism. Nathan had been sleeping with Ashley for 2 years, had a whole secret credit card for their hotel rooms and dinners, and somehow this was about me not being submissive enough? The rage that had been simmering since the divorce suddenly boiled over. Maybe if you'd been meeting his needs at home, Frank started, and that's when my father lunged across the room. At 68, Dad wasn't exactly spry, but he'd been a boxer in college and still had the instincts. His fist connected with Frank's jaw with a crack that echoed through the room, and Frank went down hard, taking Grandma's birthday cake with him on the way down. The pristine white frosting with pink roses ended up all over his face and shirt. You don't talk to my daughter that way, Dad said, shaking his hand out. His knuckles were already swelling, but he looked satisfied. You don't talk to any woman that way. Mom was beside him immediately with a bag of frozen peas from the kitchen, pressing it against his hand while giving Frank a look that could have stripped paint. Catherine stood over Frank as he tried to wipe cake from his eyes. I want a divorce, she said, her voice steady and clear. I've wanted one for years, but I stayed for the kids. Well, they're all grown now, and I'm done. She looked at Michael. Your father can live with you since you agree with his philosophy so much. See how you like taking care of a man who thinks you exist to serve him. Michael's wife, Rachel, who'd been silent in the corner this whole time, suddenly stood up. Actually, Michael can live with him solo. I'm taking the kids and going to my mother's. The look of shock on Michael's face would have been funny if the whole situation wasn't so awful. Rachel, honey, let's discuss this at home, he started. But she was already gathering her purse and their 2 young kids. There's nothing to discuss. I've been listening to you and your father go down this rabbit hole for months. The comments about my job, the jokes about me needing to be more traditional. I thought it would pass, but clearly it's getting worse. She picked up their 3-year-old daughter, while their 5-year-old son clung to her leg. I won't raise my daughter in a house where she's taught she's less than her brother. I won't raise my son to think he's entitled to women's servitude. Frank finally managed to get to his feet, cake still stuck in his hair. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Look at you all, turning on your own family over some basic truths about human nature. But nobody was listening anymore. Catherine was on her phone with someone, probably a lawyer from the sound of the conversation. Rachel had already left with the kids, and Michael was standing there looking like his world had imploded. Lisa's boyfriend, who I'd forgotten was even there, finally spoke up. For what it's worth, Mr. Frank, I've been studying gender dynamics in my sociology program, and everything you're citing has been thoroughly debunked. The websites you're reading are part of a well-documented pipeline designed to radicalize men who feel displaced by social progress. He was young, maybe 25, with a gentle voice, but Frank rounded on him like he was a threat. And who are you to lecture me, boy? Some liberal college student who's been brainwashed by feminist professors? The boyfriend, whose name I realized I still didn't know, stood his ground. I'm someone who's watching you destroy your family over ideology you found on the internet. My name is David, by the way, and I love your niece Lisa exactly as she is. Brilliant, independent, and accomplished. Lisa grabbed David's hand and squeezed it, tears running down her face but smiling for the first time since this nightmare started. We should go, she said softly. I don't want to be here anymore. As they gathered their things, Frank made one last desperate attempt to salvage his position. You're all going to regret this. When society collapses because men have been emasculated and women have abandoned their roles, you'll see I was right. He looked around the room like a prophet expecting converts, but all he got were disgusted stares and turned backs. Even his younger sons, twins in their early 20s, were edging toward the door looking embarrassed. Grandma wheeled herself closer to Frank, her oxygen tank trailing behind. Franklin James Morrison, you listen to me. Your grandfather came from Italy with nothing. He respected women because he knew what real strength was. Your father, for all his faults, learned to respect women because he knew what it cost to lose them. You, she pointed a gnarled finger at him. You've confused control with strength, domination with leadership. You're 85 years old, mother. The world has changed. Frank's voice was sullen now, like a child being scolded. Grandma laughed again, that wheezing sound that was half mirth, half medical condition. The world has changed many times in my lifetime. I've seen wars, depressions, social movements. You know what hasn't changed? Weak men blaming women for their own failures. The room was starting to empty now. Dad was helping Mom gather our things while keeping his swollen hand elevated. Megan was texting furiously on her phone, probably telling her friends about the insane family drama. Catherine had disappeared into the guest room, presumably to pack her things. The twins had slipped out without saying goodbye, and Michael was still standing in the middle of the room looking lost. Dad, Michael said finally, his voice small. Rachel's really leaving me. She's really taking the kids. Frank didn't even look at his son, too busy trying to salvage his dignity while covered in birthday cake. She'll come back. They always do when they realize they need us. But even Michael didn't look convinced anymore. I walked over to Grandma and knelt beside her wheelchair. I'm sorry your birthday was ruined, I whispered. She patted my cheek with one soft hand that smelled like lavender and medicine. Honey, this is the best birthday I've had in years. Finally, some truth came out. Finally, some of you stood up to him. She looked over at Catherine, who had emerged with a suitcase. I'm proud of you all. As we were leaving, Uncle Frank made one more announcement to the nearly empty room. I'm starting a men's group for anyone who wants to reclaim their masculinity and learn about natural hierarchy. The only response was Grandma's oxygen tank humming and the sound of car doors slamming outside. Michael finally seemed to snap out of his daze. Dad, I need to go talk to Rachel. I need to fix this. Let her go, Frank said dismissively. If she can't appreciate what she has, you're better off without her. Michael stared at his father for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his face. What I had was a wife who loved me, 2 beautiful kids, and a good life, and I'm losing it because I listened to you and your internet bullshit. The confrontation between father and son was cut short by Catherine returning with 2 more suitcases. Michael, you can help me load these in my car, or you can stay here with your father and his men's group. Michael immediately grabbed the suitcases and followed his mother out. Frank was left standing in his living room, covered in cake, surrounded by the debris of his family. We drove home in silence for the first few miles, Megan in the backseat still processing everything. Finally, she spoke up. Mom, was Uncle Frank always like that? I thought about it, remembering family gatherings from my childhood. He was always traditional, always a little controlling. But this is new. Or maybe it was always there, and he just found a community online that told him it was okay. The internet's weird, Megan said, wisdom beyond her 16 years. People find these echo chambers that reinforce their worst impulses. She paused. I'm glad Grandma stood up to him. And Great-Grandpa hitting him was kind of awesome. I shouldn't have laughed, but I did. Don't tell your grandfather I said this, but it was pretty satisfying to watch. My phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. David proposed in the car. Said if your uncle taught him anything, it's that he wants to be the opposite kind of husband. I said yes. I showed Megan, and we both smiled. Something good coming from something so ugly. Another text? This one from Catherine. Lawyer's appointment tomorrow at 9 a.m. Staying with my sister tonight. Thank you all for standing up to him. A week later, we got word that Frank's men's group had its first meeting. 3 people showed up, including Frank. One was his drinking buddy Carl, who left after Frank started talking about government conspiracies to feminize men through soy products. The other was a 22-year-old kid who thought he was joining a support group for divorced men and left when Frank started ranking women by their submission potential. Michael and Rachel were in counseling. She'd agreed to try if he cut all contact with the online communities his father had introduced him to and started individual therapy to deprogram what he'd absorbed. The therapist, according to Rachel's text updates to the family group chat, which didn't include Frank, said Michael was responding well, but had a lot of work to do. Catherine filed for divorce and discovered Frank had been hiding money in cryptocurrency, convinced the government was going to seize his assets to redistribute to single mothers. The divorce lawyer, a woman named Patricia who specialized in high-conflict divorces, called it one of the most straightforward cases she'd ever seen. Frank had documented his entire ideology online, providing Catherine with pages of evidence for why she should get primary assets. Grandma passed away 3 months after her birthday party. At the funeral, Frank sat alone in the back row while the rest of us gathered around Catherine and her kids. In her will, Grandma left Frank a single item, a book on the history of women's suffrage with a note that said, "It's never too late to learn." She left the house to Catherine, who sold it and used the money to start a foundation for women leaving controlling relationships. During the reception after the funeral, Frank approached our group near the buffet table. He looked older, grayer, diminished somehow. I've been thinking, he started, but Catherine held up her hand. Frank, today is about Mom. If you can't be respectful, you need to leave. He nodded slowly and walked away, but not before I heard him mutter something about emotional women making everything difficult. Lisa and David got married the following spring in a small ceremony where they wrote their own vows. David promised to support her career, celebrate her achievements, and never dim her light to make himself feel brighter. Lisa promised to love him for exactly who he was, not who society said he should be. Michael attended with Rachel and their kids, and during the reception, he apologized to Lisa for what he'd said at Grandma's birthday. I was lost, he told her. Dad was so confident, so sure he had the answers, and I was struggling with feeling inadequate at work, at home. It was easier to blame society than look at myself. Lisa hugged him, and they both cried a little. Just don't go back there, she said. Those communities prey on men's insecurities and turn them into monsters. Frank started showing up at family events again about a year later, always alone, always slightly defensive. He'd corner younger male relatives and try to share his theories, but word had spread about Grandma's birthday disaster. The men would politely excuse themselves, and Frank would end up sitting alone, scrolling through his phone, reading articles that confirmed what he already believed. At Christmas that year, Megan, now 17 and applying to colleges, gave a presentation about her senior project on online radicalization and gender politics. She'd interviewed family members about the birthday incident and used it as a case study. Frank tried to storm out when he realized what it was about, but Catherine blocked the door. You're going to sit here and listen to what your ideology did to this family. The presentation was brilliant, connecting Frank's online rabbit hole to larger patterns of radicalization, showing how vulnerable men were targeted with content that blamed women for societal changes. She included screenshots from the websites Frank frequented, highlighting the manipulation tactics and logical fallacies. She ended with statistics about domestic violence increases in households where men consumed this content. Frank sat through it all, his face red, his hands clenched. When Megan finished, the room erupted in applause. Even Michael stood up, clapping hard. Frank finally spoke. You've all been brainwashed. One day you'll see I was trying to save this family. But his voice was hollow, defeated. He knew he'd lost. Probably had known since that birthday when his own mother called him an idiot. Catherine stood up, stronger than I'd ever seen her. Frank, you didn't try to save this family. You tried to control it. There's a difference between leadership and domination, between strength and abuse. Real men don't need to subjugate women to feel powerful. Real men find their strength in partnership, in equality, in lifting others up. Real men, Frank spit the words like they tasted bad. You wouldn't know a real man if one stood in front of you. Catherine smiled sadly. I was married to one for 37 years. I just didn't realize until recently that he'd disappeared, replaced by someone who needed to make others smaller to feel big. The divorce was finalized that spring. Frank got the minimum in the settlement because his cryptocurrency gamble had crashed, losing most of their retirement savings. He moved into a small apartment where neighbors reported he spent most of his time online, diving deeper into communities that told him he was a victim of the feminist agenda. Michael and Rachel had another baby, a daughter they named after Grandma. At the hospital, Michael held his newborn and cried. "I almost lost this," he told me. "I almost threw away everything that mattered for an ideology that made me feel powerful, but actually made me weak." Rachel squeezed his hand. They'd made it through, but barely. 5 years have passed since that birthday party. Frank is still alone, still angry, still posting articles about societal collapse on Facebook to an audience of 3 people. Catherine remarried a lovely man named Robert who cooks dinner every night and asks her opinion on everything from investments to what color to paint the kitchen. She laughs more now, looks younger despite being 5 years older. Lisa and David have a son who they're raising to be kind, respectful, and strong in ways that have nothing to do with domination. Michael coaches his daughter's soccer team and teaches them they can be anything they want. He volunteers with a group that helps men escape from extremist online communities, sharing his story as a warning. Megan graduated from college with a degree in sociology and now works with an organization that tracks online hate groups. She says Uncle Frank's meltdown was the best education she could have gotten about how extremism takes hold. She keeps a photo from Grandma's 85th birthday on her desk. Not of the cake-covered Frank, but of all the women in the family standing together after he'd stormed out. Sometimes I think about that moment when Uncle Frank asked his question about controlling women. How different things might have been if we'd all just nervously laughed and changed the subject, the way families often do with uncomfortable topics. But Grandma's cough, Lisa's anger, my father's fist, Catherine's courage, they all combined to expose something that had been festering beneath the surface. The internet didn't radicalize Frank so much as give him permission to voice what he'd always believed. It gave him a community that validated his worst impulses, that told him his failures were women's fault, that his need for control was actually strength. But real strength, we learned that day, was Catherine leaving, Michael admitting he was wrong, and all of us standing up to say no more. At our latest family gathering, Frank wasn't invited. Catherine hosted, and the house was full of laughter, debate, and partnership. Men cooked alongside women, children played without rigid gender roles, and nobody asked permission to speak. David and my new boyfriend compared recipes while Lisa and Michael discussed a business idea. Rachel and Catherine planned a girls' trip while Robert played with the grandkids. "Do you miss him?" I asked Catherine as we watched the healthy family dynamic we'd built from the ashes of the old. She thought for a moment. "I miss who he used to be, or who I thought he was, but that person probably never existed." She paused. "I'm grateful, though. His extremism freed me from a marriage that was quietly oppressive for decades." The last I heard, Frank had joined a new online community. This one focused on expatriating to countries with traditional values. He posts photos of himself alone in various locations, always with captions about how American women don't appreciate real men. The comments are from other lonely men validating his choices, trapped in the same echo chamber that destroyed his family. Meanwhile, we've all moved forward. Not without scars. Rachel still flinches sometimes when Michael raises his voice, and Catherine still sometimes asks permission for things she doesn't need to. But we're healing, growing, creating something better than what we had before. The birthday party that should have destroyed us actually saved us by forcing the poison to the surface where we could see it clearly. Megan wrote about it in her college thesis, how one question destroyed and rebuilt a family. She interviewed all of us, even tried to interview Frank, but he refused unless she agreed to present his side without criticism. She included his refusal in the thesis, noting it as typical of the movement's inability to engage with legitimate criticism. "Isn't it time we controlled our women properly?" Frank had asked. The answer, delivered by 3 generations of his family, was a resounding no. But more than that, it was a revelation that the question itself was the problem. Women don't need to be controlled. Families don't need hierarchies based on gender. Strength doesn't come from dominance. Real strength comes from Grandma using her last birthday to speak truth, from Catherine finding freedom at 60, from Michael admitting he was wrong, from Rachel protecting her children, from Lisa refusing to diminish herself, from Megan using her voice, from all of us saying, we deserve better, and we won't accept less. The family reunion that was meant to celebrate Grandma's 85 years became the moment we all chose who we wanted to be. Frank chose isolation and ideology. The rest of us chose each other, chose growth, chose love that doesn't require submission. And in the end, that's the only control that matters. The control over our own lives, our own choices, our own futures. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.